Jesus called his 12 disciples to him and gave them authority to drive out evil spirits and to heal every disease and sickness.
The Bible contains remarkable stories of miracles and divine interventions. Moses parted the sea. Peter healed a man lame from his mother's womb. Jesus drove demons out of people and raised others from the dead. But are these types of events still happening today?
We too have a beam of divine light and guidance that God has put within the heart of every man. And it's one of the greatest proofs that there is a God.
More amazing supernatural things are happening than we realize.
This is Divine Intervention, the interview show that features intriguing people who've experienced the hand of God in amazing ways. Divine Intervention was created and produced with the purpose of encouraging believers, spiritual seekers, and skeptics alike that Jesus is alive and is still performing miracles and working in the world today.
I believe in miracles.
Here's your host, Daniel Fazina.
Hello and welcome, friend, to another exciting episode of Divine Intervention Radio. I am your host, Daniel Fazina. Very excited to be with you to bring yet another really intriguing topic and a wonderful guest to introduce you to. I have the privilege of speaking with Del Tackett, and we are very excited to have him because he is delving into a subject matter that is dear to my heart, and that is the historicity of Genesis. Specifically, is it reliable? Can we really take Genesis as history, and is the Earth young, relatively young, or is it billions of years old, as evolutionists purport? The Genesis history tells of a 6-day creation, and that the history of both the Earth and the universe are relatively young, roughly 6,000 years-ish, and yet many scientists would disagree with that. But there are many others who are scientists and also creationists who Del Tackett interviews in his new film, Is Genesis History?, that agree with Genesis as far as a young Earth and a young universe model. And we'll definitely get to that. But before we get to our esteemed guest, I want to remind you that you can always find Divine Intervention on our website. DivineInterventionRadio.com is the web address there. You can also find us on Facebook, facebook.com/Divine Intervention Radio. And of course on YouTube, Divine Intervention Radio on YouTube.com as well. All the shows are archived there. So let me introduce you to Dr. Del Tackett. Dr. Del Tackett is a former president of Focus on the Family Institute and a former senior vice president of Focus on the Family. He created Focus on the Family's The Truth Project, a nationwide project to bring the Christian worldview to the body of Christ. Tackett served more than 20 years in the U.S. Air Force and was appointed by George W. Bush as the Director of Technical Planning for the National Security Council. Tackett's degrees are from Colorado Technical University with a DM, Auburn University with an MS, and Kansas State University with a BS. His many published works include pieces on worldview and cultural issues, and he's a popular conference speaker. And he speaks on such topics such as American Christian heritage, Christian worldview, technical subjects, and management. His website is isgenesishistory.com. That's isgenesishistory.com, and it's my pleasure to welcome Del Tackett right now on Divine Intervention Radio. Del, welcome to Divine Intervention Radio. It's an honor to have you. Thanks for joining us.
Oh, my pleasure, Daniel. Great to be with you and your listeners.
Oh, wonderful. Well, I've been looking forward to this interview for a long time, and as I mentioned, not only did I really love the Is Genesis History film, which we're going to get to, but I also went through your Truth Project with the Focus on the Family group, and it really had a big impact on me, and it was the first time that I actually thought of the truth as a person in Jesus Christ rather than just a concept. So thank you so much for your great work.
Well, my pleasure. The Lord has placed His hands upon that, and it's not because of me. It's just gone all over the world, and He has really changed people's lives, and so we give Him the glory for that.
Amen. Well, before we get into your most recent work with the Is Genesis History, why don't you take us to the beginning a little bit? Tell us about your background, growing up, and how you became a believer in the Lord, first of all, and then we'll go from there, okay?
You bet. I grew up on a ranch, a farm in Idaho, and really cannot remember any time in my life when I didn't believe in God, didn't believe in Jesus, read my Bible a lot. But it really wasn't until I was in pilot training for the Air Force when all of a sudden I don't know, it's those times where all of a sudden the Lord opens your mind and heart at the same time. And it was like I heard the gospel for the first time, even though, again, I felt like I had known him all my life. And so I went out into the middle of a cotton field in West Texas and basically said, Lord, I feel like I've known you all my life, but I've never really understood it like this. And so that's where I dedicated myself to the Lord or rededicated. I don't really know. He knows that.
Right.
But that was another turning point in my life.
And how old were you at that point?
Well, I was early 20s.
Okay, nice. Well, I can kind of relate to that, having grown up in a Christian home, but really taking my faith seriously in my late teens and early 20s, really growing in the Lord. Because as I try to tell people, just like being born only takes a few minutes, being similarly with being born again, but growing,
that's true.
Requires a lifetime, and the same thing spiritually.
Absolutely.
So that's wonderful. And then, going forward, you got involved in the U.S. Armed Forces, in the Air Force, and the Lord kind of directed you to different places. How did He, lead you going from that early 20s in the cotton field to, going forward from there?
Well, my whole life has basically been characterized by the Lord snatching me by the neck and almost transporting me different places. And I don't mean that in some weird way. It's just that it's the providential hand of God. And,
right.
We really do serve a risen Lord. We serve a God who is real. He is present. And He providentially works in the events around us. He works in people's lives, and so those are those times where all of a sudden it's like you get a phone call and your life has changed. Mm-hmm. You get a message or some event occurs and your life is never the same again. Those are I see those as the providential events that God has used to direct me to various places in my life. Now, of course, when you're in the Air Force, a lot of times those directions come from orders.
Right.
But sometimes we actually see those orders that come from human agencies as the providential hand of God.
And can you give us some examples of what happened there and how God led you?
Well, I think probably the most dramatic in my life was when I was at the White House. I was serving under George H.W. Bush, and it was in the midst of serving him at the White House. I was the director of technical plans for the National Security Council. That I began to do a lot of study of the writing of the founding generation, mm-hmm. and the more I studied that, the more I began to realize that they had a biblical worldview. They were not perfect by any stretch of the imagination,
right.
but they had a biblical worldview of all of life. And it was a really dramatic moment for me. I took in the family to hear a reenactment of Washington's farewell address. And in that address, which Washington felt was the last time that he was going to publicly be able to address the people of this nation that, to a great extent, he had helped birth, that he mentioned so very clearly, he said that this nation, everything that we have built, was built upon, in his words, was religion and morality. Mm. And when they meant religion, they weren't talking about just some smorgasbord. They were talking about the reality of a biblical worldview. I think that's what they meant. And so it struck me deeply that the problem we had in this culture was that we had walked away from that fundamental biblical worldview. And so those were times when the Lord's hand is heavy on you. I couldn't sleep. He was running the verse from Revelation in my mind over and over and over again. Remember the height from which you've fallen. If you do not repent, I will come to you and remove the lampstand from its place. And that caused me to realize that I had to leave. I had a very promising career there, but I had to leave and do whatever I could to get the body of Christ healthy, to be light and salt again. And so that started this whole period in my life now, where we've been doing everything we can to do that, to help the body of Christ get healthy and strong again.
Well, you certainly do an excellent job with the work you've done so far, and I know your work is not finished yet. But from the Truth History, the Truth Project to Is Genesis History, some really great stuff there, and stuff that's, I think, vitally needed in the body of Christ and in our culture, because we seem to live in a shifting sands kind of society where everyone has their own truth, their own personal truth. Yes. Or, we heard Oprah Winfrey say that recently at one of those television awards, that you have to speak your own truth, your own personal truth. And my thought to that was, especially after having seen the Truth Project, is that truth is objective. It doesn't depend on you or me, what we think of it. And then even further than that, as I mentioned before, Jesus Christ said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. The truth as a person. And even when he was being questioned by Pontius Pilate, Pilate even asked him, what is truth? Because Jesus said, I come to testify to the truth. So I think we're kind of losing that as a society. But so getting back to your story, after you left the White House, is that when you went into focus on the family and started developing the Truth Project, or how did that come about?
No, actually, when I left the White House, I'll be honest with you, Daniel, I was clueless. I didn't know what God wanted in terms of practically. I just knew that I had said goodbye, and goodbye to a lot of wonderful things. Right. And so the way the Lord works oftentimes is He doesn't send us an email, He doesn't send us a text. We would really like that, because that would make things really easy and really clear. But He has decreed that we will walk this life as a walk of faith, and so oftentimes He will point. And sometimes it grabs by the scruff of the neck, and he will yank us out of somewhere and set us down. But we'll look around and say, well, okay, now what? And that's when this walk of faith is required. And so I left the White House and went back to Colorado Springs. We had a home there that we had rented out while we were in D.C., and I began to work with a defense contractor. That was my vocation is in software engineering. And in the meantime, the Lord began at praying and so forth. The Lord then raised up several people who felt that the Lord was calling them to start a seminary. And well, I'd never thought about that. But then it dawned on me. I said, we have the opportunity to build a seminary that is worldview centric. And we can begin to raise up men who would speak in the pulpit in this biblical worldview framework. And so I thought that was what the Lord wanted, and it was initially, because I then spent, hours and hours and hours developing a biblical worldview content, a series of courses for the seminary, about 300 contact hours.
Wow.
And that was the beginning of the content for the Truth Project. And then providentially, God yanked me out of there. That was a very, very difficult time when the Lord yanked me out of there and took me to focus, because I did not understand what He was doing. And those are details in a story that's probably too long, but it's another one of those providential things where God stopped what I was doing at the seminary, plopped me down at Focus on the Family. In looking back, Focus on the Family at that time was the only one I think that could have provided the money that was necessary to film this content, and which people now know as the Truth Project.
Right. That's great. So you were able to take the things you developed at the seminary and translate it into a like kind of a home study course through Focus on the Family and bringing it out to the masses.
Yes, that's correct.
That's amazing.
Yeah, that was all the Lord's doing. Because I see that's the amazing thing about the Christian walk. We look back and we say, we couldn't have scripted this. There's no way would we have written this kind of a story. But God is the one who puts all these plans together, and oftentimes we don't recognize it. We don't understand it. I used to tell my students all the time. I said, the Christian life is like riding a car that God has painted over the windshield. And now it's terrifying if you're driving a car, but if you slide over and let Him drive, this is an adventure beyond any adventure in all of creation.
Amen to that. Friend, you're listening to Divine Intervention Radio. I'm your host, Daniel Fazina, and if you're just tuning in, we are speaking with our special guest, Dr. Del Tackett. He is the creator of the Truth Project, and the new film is Genesis History, which I had the opportunity to screen, and it is amazing. Del, why don't we get into a little bit of Is Genesis History? First of all, I wanted to tell you, great job on the film, by the way. You interview people from all walks of life and from all disciplines, ranging from paleontology to astronomy, zoology, all sorts of scientific disciplines. And what I really appreciate about this is that, some people might think, if they're creationists, they can't really be intelligent or they can't be scientists. Every single person you interview had a PhD. I was very impressed with that. So,
yes,
great.
That's correct.
Yeah, great way to track down some of the world's experts who happen to also be biblical creationists. So tell me, how did this conversation with a 10-year-old lead to the making of this wonderful documentary film?
Well, it's a very interesting story. The 10-year-old was the daughter of Thomas Purifoy, who is the head of Compass Cinema. And he and she were having a conversation that was centered upon these questions about science and about the Bible, about origins and all of that. And in the midst of that conversation, Thomas realized that, we should have by now presented this positive case for reading Genesis as a historical narrative, but we really haven't done that. And so that's when he and I began to talk, and we decided we would make this film. And I'm thankful we did. The rest, I guess you'd say, is history.
That's right. We're talking with Dr. Del Tackett about his film. His new documentary is Genesis History. And I love this film because you can give it to a scientific-minded atheist or evolutionist, and if they're open-minded and they really listen, they're going to be hearing from some of the world's experts who are PhDs in their respective fields who also believe in the Genesis account. I personally believe it as well, a six-day creation, a relatively young Earth, relatively young universe, and there's so many nuggets in there that I want to get to, but one of the most impactful things that I saw out of it was the case study of Mount St. Helens, because here we have a known event in the past, 1980, Mount St. Helens blew its top, changed the geography all around, created huge gullies and canyons and layers in the rock strata, and we have this and we know exactly when it happened. But yet when we look at other things, or when a lot of scientists do, they look at a past event that they don't know when it happened, like for example, maybe the Colorado River, the Grand Canyon. They look at that and they say, well, it happened over millions of years. And yet we have this perfect laboratory in what happened in Mount St. Helens. Can you touch on that and tell us a little bit more detail on that?
You bet. Mount St. Helens is a fascinating place, and we were there with Dr. Steve Austin. And by the way, just in light of what you were saying, Dr. Austin has this incredible perspective of Mount St. Helens. He says that this is the Rosetta Stone for geology. And what a great way to characterize it, because just as you said, we know what happened there. We don't have to guess. And all of these very complex geological structures that we now have there, the canyons with all of the stratified layers, we know that was laid down. All of those were laid down in almost an instant in geological time, in hours and days. And so that Rosetta Stone helped us then to look at all of the other layers around the world and to ask the very honest question: could these also have been laid down in a catastrophic event in which that material was hydrosorted? And indeed, I believe that when you look at places like the Grand Canyon or Table Mountain in Cape Town, South Africa, or England, all over the world, we see these stratified sedimentary layers. And I believe if you look at them honestly, you have to, I think, conclude that they were not laid down over millions of years. They were laid down in a rapid fashion, such that you do not have erosion between the layers and a lot of the other characteristics that we see. And so Mount St. Helens is just, I think, God's gift to us that helps us understand just how a lot of these things happened.
That is amazing. Very fascinating stuff. I've done a little bit of research on Mount St. Helens as well. And one of the amazing things I saw was that a lot of the trees that were blown down, they went down into Spirit Lake at the bottom of the mountain there, and they got waterlogged over time, and some of them fossilized. And some of them even fossilized when they sank to the bottom of the lake. They sank upside down. So you end up with fossilized trees that are totally upside down. And we know that it happened, in 1980, so that's, 37 years ago? They didn't form millions of years ago. And you can see some of these similar fossils all over the world. It's amazing.
Yeah. Well, the other thing that is really fascinating about Spirit Lake is that those logs that were floating on top of the lake. In fact, after the earthquake, there was someone flying over, looked down, and said Spirit Lake was gone because all they saw were these trees, massive amount of trees that they were floating on the lake, but it looked like they were on top of the ground. Well, those logs, as the wind blew them around and the water, the force of the water bobbing them up and down, they began to mill each other, and all of the bark on those logs began to fall down to the bottom of the lake and began to build a very deep layer of peat. Well, Dr. Steve Austin, one of his specialties is the study of coal beds. And even before Mount St. Helens happened, he had already proposed looking at coal beds. He said these coal beds are not formed in the way that we say they are today in a swamp, because that peat material is very, very fine. It is a long period of time, and that material breaks down. He said, but the coal seams that we find have very rough bark material in them. And he then proposed, he said, that the coal seams were formed as a result of log masses. And that was just before Mount St. Helens occurred.
Wow.
And now he has the proof of that. He's actually put on a scuba set and gone down to the bottom of that lake. And that's what I love about these scientists, Daniel. These are scientists who are in the field. They're not just pontificating in some classroom somewhere. These are scientists who are in the field. Dr. Art Chadwick and digging bones in Wyoming. And so I think people will find the film fascinating.
Absolutely. Again, the film is called Is Genesis History? You can find more information at isgenesishistory.com. We're speaking with the creator and producer of it, Dr. Del Tackett. He's also the host of it, and just does a fine, fine job. And incidentally, you can get a copy of this DVD and give it to an unbelieving friend, a coworker, particularly if they're scientific-minded. Maybe they're an atheist or an evolutionist, and if they're honest and they really give it an open-minded view, they're going to be challenged, because we're really presenting, or Del and his scientists are presenting tangible evidence that's going to go against the Big Bang Theory, that's going to go against the billions of years of evolution theory, and it's going to really corroborate the Bible, at least in our opinion. So take a look at it, isgenesishistory.com. Again, we're speaking with Dr. Del Tackett, and we'll be right back after the break with more. Stay with us on Divine Intervention Radio.
You're listening to Divine Intervention with Daniel Pazina, and we'll return in just a moment.
I believe in miracles.
Hi, I'm Kevin McCullough. You may know me from Fox News or Talk Radio. Have you ever wondered or pondered the idea of working for yourself or owning your own business? Using your skills to build a vision or a passion for your own life? Think about it. No boss, no politics, no compromise, no commute, no employees, no discrimination, and no educational requirements. Just building something positive that impacts people's lives. Well, you can get started owning your own energy company for less than $500. Would you like to know how? It's through a great company called Ambit. You can find out more when you go to freepowernow.com. That's freepowernow.com. Or if you're really interested in getting started, call my good friend Daniel Fazina, an independent energy consultant with Ambit. He's ready to help you get started on a brand new career. 205-55-AMBIT. That's 205-55-AMBIT or freepowernow.com.
Hey, this is Daniel Fazina of Divine Intervention Radio. The Bible contains some incredible stories of miracles and divine interventions. Jesus calmed a raging storm, healed paralytics, and even raised the dead. But are these types of events still happening today? The answer to this question, as you will see from reading my book, Divine Intervention, 50 True Stories of God's Miracles Today, is an emphatic yes. Contained within the book is a collection of amazing true stories that attest to this fact. You will read the astonishing first-hand accounts of people who have been healed of paralysis, terminal cancer, and tumors through prayer. You will see the love of God powerfully transform the life of an Islamic terrorist. You will witness the liberation of the demon-possessed, the resurrection of the dead, and much more. Prepare to be awed and inspired as you experience divine intervention. More information about Divine Intervention, 50 True Stories of God's Miracles Today can be found at www.divineinterventionradio.com or by calling 800-247-4784. That's 1-800-247-4784.
They make a monkey right out of me. Yes, they've been trying endlessly. But over eager bone diggers, they'll never find that jigsaw piece.
Now I ain't hating on the bone diggers, but I say evolution don't figure. Now I ain't hating on the bone diggers, but I ain't never seen no holes bigger. It sounds like no evidence found. It sounds like the head's in the ground. It sounds like they're just too proud. It sounds quite boneheaded. You need the pond where the evolution is wrong, where the maybe was put on under cover of dawn. They said we can tell from rocks, we can tell by the carbon, cause this world has got a flock of descendants of Charles Robert Darwin. But I'm looking for the odds at casinos that life could come to be from random acids amino zero. We know it's hocus pocus, and they gotta make all of that an accidental process. Okay, let's pretend a fishy had some kids that stood up on their fins and crawled up on land without evidence, and here we are today. If you're trusting in this world, you better have faith. You know why? They make too much of nothing. Stuff that I heard it should have been on Mythbusters. Their best friends' examples couldn't cut the mustard. You don't care what none of us say, still trusted. Nah, I ain't hating on the bone diggers, but I say evolution don't figure. Nah, I ain't hating on the bone diggers, but I ain't.
Welcome back to Divine Intervention Radio. I'm your host, Daniel Fazina. And you can find us online, divineinterventionradio.com, facebook.com/Divine Intervention Radio, and of course on YouTube as well. All of our shows are archived there, youtube.com, Divine Intervention Radio. If you're just tuning in, we are speaking with our special guest, Dr. Del Tackett, and he is telling us about his new documentary film, Is Genesis History?, in which he presents a positive, evidence-based argument for the reliability of the Bible as history, in particular, the book of Genesis. Dr. Del Tackett, welcome back.
Hey, my pleasure to be with you, Daniel.
Awesome. So before the break, we were talking about a little bit about your story and also some of the fascinating pieces of evidence. We were talking about geology mostly, but there's so many different facets of your film and different disciplines. One of the other ones that really struck me as well was in the area of paleontology, where you're talking with people who are studying dinosaur bones. And one particular piece of information that I really found fascinating was the fact that scientists are now discovering soft tissue and even blood cells inside of dinosaur bones. How is that possible if these bones are supposedly billions of years old?
Well, that is a very, very strong inconsistency that we're now discovering that this is not just an isolated case that occurred back when a dinosaur bone broke and they smelled what appeared to be like rotting odor, and as they examined it, they found that indeed the material within that dinosaur bone was still viable. It was soft, it was spongy, stretchy. Even the blood cells, as you said, are still evident. Well, that material breaks down rapidly, and it's almost inconceivable that we would find that material still viable and soft inside a dinosaur bone if it indeed had been around for millions of years. It's difficult enough to think that it's been around for thousands of years, but the fact of the matter is it's there and it's present. And now we're finding that that's not just an anomaly. We find it in other places as well. We don't normally just break open dinosaur bones, but when that is done, this material is there. And so it raises the question, it has to raise the question, of whether or not we've got this dating stuff correct, because it's certainly an evidence that it can't be that old.
What has the scientific community's reaction been to these discoveries?
Well, my understanding is that right now, of course, there was a lot of denial in the beginning. In the beginning, they said, "Oh, well, that was not dinosaur tissue. That is some evasive thing that had gotten into the bone later on, more recently." I think the other thing that they're trying to look at now is to talk about the amount of nickel that possibly could have preserved that. I think it's a struggle right now. I'm no doubt. I think they will try to come up with some natural cause, because the current scientific paradigm is wedded to naturalism, the philosophy of naturalism, and it cannot, no matter what the evidence is, it cannot conclude anything but natural cause. That's just the way it's bounded. It's, in a sense, it's rigged to that, and that is why people will look at creation scientists and say, well, that's not real science, because the current paradigm has defined science within the philosophy of naturalism. So if you conclude anything that is outside of a natural cause, then they declare that not to be science. But, that's not true in terms of scientific paradigms in the past. Kepler, he said that the chief end of scientific investigation is to study the order that God imposed upon it. And so they were allowed, in a paradigm before the current paradigm, they were allowed to conclude both natural cause and supernatural cause. But in the current paradigm, you're only allowed to conclude natural cause. That's the only way. You cannot get materials published, articles published. You can't produce anything that points to anything but a natural cause.
So would you say the naturalists have, or at least are working to achieve an intellectual monopoly on the scientific community?
Well, it's not that they're attempting to achieve a monopoly. It's just the characteristic of scientific paradigms. And that's why I encourage people to read Thomas Kuhn's book, where he lays out the history of science and how, from the very beginning, a scientific paradigm would arise. And when that paradigm is reigning, then it captures people's thoughts. It's not that there is something devious here. It's just when you're captured in that paradigm, you don't think of things outside of the paradigm. And yet what happens over time is that the evidence piles up against that paradigm, inconsistencies, things don't fit, the conclusions don't seem to work as well, and it collapses, and another paradigm arises, and that one collapses. And so Kuhn looks at the history of science, and he says, we really are simply in the middle of another scientific paradigm. And I believe, I think Kuhn presents as well, I believe that the current paradigm will collapse. And it's going to, because the evidence is becoming so overwhelming. I mean, the more we look in microbiology and we look at the incredible, exquisite complexity of the order and the machinery within the living cell, it's getting almost ridiculous to cover your eyes and close your ears and say, all this happened as a result of random processes.
And you, as a computer programmer, you can probably have a special appreciation for this because you know what complexity goes into even computer programs, which pale in comparison to the complexity of the human body and our animal kingdom family, right?
That is absolutely true. In fact, I remember, and I'm pretty old. I was back there towards the very beginning of the development of computers and the first real software engineering. But at the time, it was kind of the holy grail of software engineering was to find a true random number generator. The problem with the random number generators that we created was they eventually produced a pattern. And as soon as they produced a pattern, we knew that it wasn't random. And yet we have more than patterns when we look at the world around us, and in particular look deep into living cells. This is not just a pattern. This is an exquisite order of a magnitude beyond anything that we have created, and yet we look at that order and continue to maintain that it came about through random processes, which in itself is a problem with the definition of randomness. So,
wow. I think, when you look at all the evidence, the preponderance of evidence, the overwhelming evidence of design in nature, and then you look at these scientists who are really intelligent and brilliant people, I think it really speaks to the fact that there's a spiritual blindness, there's a spiritual component to these people who cannot see what's right in front of them, what's so clear. And I don't know, it just baffles my mind how someone so intelligent could really either discount or just want to put their head in the sand and not see this stuff. Yeah. I mean, when you were in St. Thomas talking to the guy at the aquarium there, and he talked about how the shark swims so efficiently, and we wish we could build a submarine that would swim like that, but we can't. And even you look at the bat and how precise their echolocation is and their radar. I read somewhere that the Navy actually used bats and kind of base their radar systems on that, but yet it's not as precise as what the bat can do. So how can the bat, we understand that people created submarines by design and engineering, but the bat came about by chance? I don't get that.
Yeah. Well, that's a very, very astute observation, because we know the things that we have designed that have attempted to, in many cases, mimic what we see in the natural world around us. And we know the shark, for example, is a much better design than anything we have designed. And yet we are willing to know that a submarine is designed, but we're not willing to point to the designer of the shark or the bat. I think one of the best examples of this, Dr. Francis Crick, a brilliant scientist, high intelligence, helped discover DNA. And when he looked at the complexity of DNA, he was overwhelmed by that order and the depth of that exquisite complexity. And he knew that even the billions of years that we, I think, have manufactured, it was not enough to allow this to come about. But instead of Dr. Crick turning to God, turning and acknowledging the creator of the universe, he's bound by this scientific paradigm which demands he must conclude a natural cause. And so he looks at this exquisite order and said, well, it must have come from outer space. His theory of directed panspermia.
Yeah, that's
which really only puts the problem off a little bit. But that shows you how much the scientific paradigm is bound up in a natural cause. It has to be that.
So they don't really have a problem with God or a designer per se, but just not the God of the Bible. It can be an extraterrestrial designer.
It could be, yeah, and that's what he was proposing. And it could well be that when this current scientific paradigm collapses, it could well be that what replaces it is some intelligence in outer space that is behind the living organisms that we see.
Wow, fascinating stuff. Again, we're speaking with Dr. Del Tackett. and he is the producer of the new film, Is Genesis History, a wonderful documentary, which I highly recommend you check it out. IsGenesisHistory.com. You can find some more information there. Dr. Tackett, can you tell us, and all the people that you interviewed for this film and all the evidence you've seen, what was the biggest surprise or the biggest aha moment or confirmation to you when you were producing this film?
Well, Daniel, it's funny that you asked that, because I know people who've been through the Truth Project laugh at how I used to say every tour, this is my favorite tour. And to be honest with you, every time I was with these scientists, and sometimes we were together for days, we interviewed for hours, I was thinking, oh my goodness, this is my favorite one. But I think there's several things that stand out in my mind. One we've talked about, and that's the soft dinosaur tissue. It was fascinating to do that. And the other we've also talked about, and that was talking with Dr. Rob Carter about how the genetic material that God created in the kind had such exquisite order and depth of order that it had the potential for the kind, the dog kind, to become a dachshund or a Great Dane. It had the horse kind to become all the various horses that we see. And to talk about how that DNA has the capability of even folding on top of itself to create a new instruction set. It just, it should cause us to fall to our knees before God and say, oh God, I have shortchanged even thinking about how marvelous is your hand in the works around us.
That is amazing. So, one of the takeaways I got from that section was how, variations between kinds happen, they're observable, but we don't observe changes between kinds. And so, you can have a Chihuahua, you can have a Great Dane, which is a vastly different type of dog, but it's still a dog. And another thing is that, there are, in the Genesis account, we look at the flood account and how God directed, a pair of each kind of animal and seven of other kinds to come on the ark. And most of us don't realize how big that ark was. And Answers in Genesis and the Creation Museum has constructed a huge life-size replica of the ark.
Yeah.
And it was 2/3 the size of the Titanic. So when you take on the immense size, 3 decks high, okay, the immense size of the ark itself, plus the fact that we don't have to bring every single type of animal onto the ark, I think the Genesis story is very plausible in with the flood story. Do you have any comments, or did you have any revelation on that?
I think the flood is actually one of the keys that needs to be examined closely by people who are caught up in believing that the scientific paradigm has the absolute truth, and we need to therefore somehow remold or reinterpret in Genesis to fit that scientific paradigm. Oftentimes, people will say that the flood was just a local flood, if they accept the flood at all and not put it into a genre of myth. But if you look at that ark that they have built, and we have in the re-release tonight, actually, you will see a special feature where I take 3 Wheaton students through that ark, and we talk about just how enormous it is, and that if you consider the kinds that were viable then, that were around then, there is plenty of room. In fact, there is a lot of extra room on that ark as we walk through it. They have cages for each of the kinds. And so it puts, I think it helps people see the reality that this was not just a local flood. We've seen horrendous local floods, even in our lifetime, and we've seen people rescue other people in John boats. This is a massive seagoing vessel. It was not a local flood.
Right. And one of the other points that you guys talked about, which I find very crucial and key in this argument, is that when we look at the world today, and when scientists do, they might assume that the way things are now is the way they've always been. And if you take into account the flood story and how it messed up all the real estate, and you look at the pre-flood world from Genesis as opposed to the post-flood, and you look at the fossil record, things were very different way back when. We've got fossils of creatures that we have today, but they're like many, many times bigger than they are today in the fossil record. Dragonflies a foot long. We've got rhinoceroses that are, 2 or 3 times the size of what they are today. Turtles, way bigger than people in the fossil record. And we don't see that today. Do you have any comment on that or why that was?
Well, that is a great observation that any scientist should be able to make and realize that there was a different world that is represented by that fossil record, which is actually a mass graveyard. And this is what Dr. Kirk Wise was speaking about in the film, that we have these various epochs in time, and one is that epic of creation before the fall. But then we have this antediluvian period before the flood came, in which, and we don't know exactly why, but the earth was still in a form in which creatures grew and were very, very large. As you said, that we see it in the fossil record. It's not just animals; they're massive, massive plants that are now preserved for us in exquisite detail in the fossil record, which should clue us to the fact that those creatures and those plants were fossilized in a rapid fashion. They weren't just lying on the bottom of the ocean. They weren't lying out on the ground for millions of years. They were instantly fossilized.
Right.
And so that was a world that existed before, and that's what Peter is talking about when he talks about scoffers who will come. And in the Greek, it says they willingly unnotice. And then Peter goes back and said that God created the world. He destroyed the world at that time that was destroyed. And so it was a different world. It wasn't a different earth, so to speak, but he destroyed that world with the flood.
And I remember seeing in the Genesis account that God said that all flesh had become corrupt, not just men, but animals. And, because if you look at the very beginning, the creation, man and animals were created to live in harmony. There was no death before sin. And so my question is, and this is something I've struggled with, is that there are some animals that appear to be designed to prey on other animals. And I know that, first of all, that couldn't happen by accident because the design is so precise, but also, how did it get that way if it wasn't meant to be that way in the beginning? You know what I mean? Like the starfish,
right?
It seems to be very fine-tunedly designed to be able to grab a clam and open it with its arms and eat what's inside.
Mm-hmm. Right.
If we weren't meant to be killing and eating each other, how did that happen?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a great question, and I'm not sure that we know all the answers to that. But I think there are a couple clues there that when Adam and Eve fell, it wasn't just Adam and Eve that fell. They were the federal head not only of the entire human race, but they were the federal head of all creation because all creation fell. And that's what Paul writes about in Romans 8 when he says the entire creation is groaning in the midst of this aspect of being fallen. That's what the second law of thermodynamics in its present form tells us, that everything is in decay. That's the word that Paul uses,
right?
That it's all in decay. So from the fall, we have a long period of time in which the entire creation is now moving towards violence. And as we've already said before, there is the genetic capability for creatures to change within their kind. And it is possible that in that evil environment, that creatures began to move more and more, not only towards violence, but their body structures moved more and more towards violence.
Yeah.
That could be a part of it. The other part is that we oftentimes see these teeth and so forth, and we think that that is just for meat eating, but it could also be for plant eating as well. So I think the bottom line is we don't know for sure, but we do know that the fall had such a dramatic impact upon the entire creation that it is possible. We are seeing the results of that.
Wow. Amazing stuff. Dr. Del Tackett, we're almost out of time here, but if there's someone listening to this right now who maybe is a very scientific-minded person, doesn't believe in a 6-day creation, maybe they don't even believe in God, what would you like to say to them?
Well, I would say, first of all, that what we're trying to present is not, we're not trying to discredit your intelligence. We're not trying to discredit you as an individual. What we're trying to do is to simply say, look at the evidence and consider that the scientific paradigm that we are all bound up in our culture, that scientific paradigm will not allow the evidence to point to a divine providence, a divine creator. And my plea would be to open yourself up, to look at that evidence, and to realize that we are continuing to find evidence that is making it so difficult to hold on to a naturalistic cause. What we're saying is look at that evidence and consider the fact that it's pointing to an intelligent designer, and that intelligent designer has communicated to us in his word. And I encourage you to look at that.
Amen. Dr. Del Tackett, once again, thank you so much for joining us on Divine Intervention Radio. It's been an honor to have you.
Well, it's been my privilege, Daniel, and may the Lord bless you and your work there and all those who are listening.
Well, thank you so much. Well, friend, that about does it for another exciting episode of Divine Intervention Radio. Again, our guest has been Dr. Del Tackett. Check out his new film, Is Genesis History, at www.isgenesishistory.com. And for Divine Intervention Radio, I'm Daniel Fazina. We'll see you again next time. Take care and God bless.
You've been listening to Divine Intervention with your host, Daniel Fazina. You can email Daniel at divineintervention@mail.com. That's divineintervention@mail.com. All programs of Divine Intervention are available online at divineinterventionradio.com. That's divineinterventionradio.com. Join us next time here on Divine Intervention.
I believe in miracles.
Hi, Kevin McCullough, Fox News and Talk Radio. Let me ask you a question. Do you like the word free? Like free energy? Yeah, free electricity, free natural gas. Would that help your family budget on a month-to-month basis to get your energy bills eliminated from your month-to-month costs? Do you even know that it's possible to get free energy? Well, it completely is. My good friend Daniel Fazina is an independent energy consultant for a company called Ambit Energy, and he has put together a powerful presentation as to how you can get free energy and how to do it quickly. If you'd like more information, go to freepowernow.com. That's freepowernow.com. Or if you're ready to get free energy as fast as possible, get your energy bill and dial 205-55-AMBIT. That's 205-55-AMBIT.
Times are tough, not getting easier, but there's an opportunity that could make a significant change in your financial situation. People are paying too much for home utilities, and everybody has them. Help friends and family save money and get paid for it. No obligation. You don't even have to talk to anyone unless you want to. Just listen to a 3-minute recorded message. Call now, 715-GET-CASH. That's 715-GET-CASH. Listen, decide, and you could be on your way to a better tomorrow. 715-438-2274. That's 715-GET-CASH.